Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on enhanced partnerships, looking at what needs to happen next as opportunities open up for greater collaboration between authorities and operators, now that almost all local transport authorities are committed to Transport Act enhanced partnerships for bus services. Please note that this session is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be made available to all attendees afterwards, along with the slides and a summary note from Freeths on the key takeaways and what promises to be a very engaging and interesting session. This webinar is one of a series of webinars we are hosting covering various issues that local transport authorities and operators need to grapple with. And some of our future webinars will cover topics such as innovation and enhanced partnerships, and also a session on governance. So do keep an eye on our website and social media channels for more information. Today's session will focus on opportunities and what's next for greater collaboration between authorities and operators, which enhanced partnerships should bring. We're joined by speakers from WSP, East Sussex County Council and Freeths, and I'll ask panellists to introduce themselves shortly. The format for this afternoon will be 3 short 5 to 10 minute presentations with initial thoughts from our panellists, followed by Q&A and a panel discussion. We do have a few questions prepared, but we'd much rather hear from you. So please do engage and ask questions of the panel in the Q&A box. You're free to use the chat, but note this is visible to everyone and questions may not be picked up in time during the session. So if you'd like to ask a question to the panel, please use the Q&A function only. I'll aim to keep it to time and draw the session to a close at around 4 o'clock. I'm first going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly in turn, and then I'll come back to each of you for your initial presentations, if that's okay. So firstly, myself, I'm an infrastructure and transport lawyer with a property background, and I've got a long history of working within the parameters of rail franchises and also in the bus sector, hence my interest in enhanced partnerships and the potential road to bus franchising. I joined Freeths almost 3 years ago and I chair our national transport practice. My key personal focus areas are bus and rail. And as you'll have guessed, I'll be chairing today's session. And Dominic, if I can ask you to introduce yourself, please.
So yes, I'm Dominic Fee from WSP. I'm a transport planner and project manager, and I'm professionally qualified as a chartered highway engineer. I've been with WSP for 8 years, and I've got 16 years of experience in total, covering quite a broad range of transport modes. Specifically on the buses, my experience includes designing bus interchanges, for example, at Stoke-on-Trent and Newbury, and working with quite a variety of clients like hospitals, schools, other developers to kind of plan bus services and create bus strategies.
Thank you, Dominic. And George, if you could do the same, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm George Burnett. I'm with WSP. I've been with them since 2006, and I'm a project manager and project director. I've done a lot of major transport planning and public projects, both in the UK and overseas, mainly in various countries in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. And before joining WSP, I was for many years head of public transport at Surrey County Council, and also responsible for Surrey's first local transport plans.
Brilliant, thank you, George. And Frank?
Yes, good afternoon. It's great to be with you this afternoon. I'm part of the transport team that Michael leads, and my engagements are with the bus sector. My career started actually as a bus conductor during my student days, which I absolutely loved. And when privatisation came along, I was a very junior lawyer at the time, but an absolute cert to be involved in that, needless to say. Since then, I've been involved in various things where lawyers have had to become involved, such as the statutory quality partnerships, ticketing schemes, technology procurement, and more recently, real-time information technology procurement.
Brilliant, thank you, Frank. And then finally, Craig, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. Craig Lamberton, manager of the Transport Hub at East Sussex County Council, responsible for homeschool transport and public transport, obviously including the bus service improvement plan.
Excellent, thank you. What I'll ask each of you to do now is sort of do your kind of quick 5 to 10 minute scene setting presentations of your initial thoughts, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So if Tom could pop the next slide up, and I'll ask, I think Dominic and George together speaking from WSP. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, if you go on to the next slide. So we'll be covering 3 different topics. As we've been on this sort of national bus strategy work from the very beginning in sort of spring 2021. So we'll talk about some lessons from, that we can kind of take forward to the enhanced partnerships, challenges facing LTAs, and priorities for enhanced partnerships. We can go on to the next slide. Yeah, we've been proud to work for a number of local transport authorities since this kind of work began in spring 2021. Worked with a few LTAs to really show their strong track record in delivering improvements for bus services, and a kind of clear commitment to continue working with those operators in the future to deliver further improvements. So I'm grateful to our LTA clients from the grilling I've given them about, you know, what do you do? How does it work? You know, what do you subsidize? Is that all? What about school routes, to really get out of them the really good stuff that they're doing, any shovel-ready schemes that they have. This hasn't been a massive kind of bus strategies in the UK, hasn't been a gigantic area of work in past. So I think a lesson is that to take forward is that this has created quite a surge in demand for staff in this area. And so if you're, say, at an LTA looking to your legal team or your democratic services team when it comes to how do I run the EP board, you know, how do I manage that meeting? This is probably an area that they haven't had a massive amount of contact with in the past. If we go to the next slide, I think another lesson is that, you know, this is an area where things are moving very quickly. DFT is working very hard. Their guidance is evolving very quickly. At such a kind of pace, some aspects of the kind of guidance and expectations have been very well intentions. The aims have been good, but they haven't quite panned out quite as expected. For example, suggested amounts of data for an LTA to seek from local bus operators. We've worked hard to set kind of pro formas and go to operators and say, can you please fill it in this format? But inevitably you're dealing with totally separate organizations, and so you do get quite a lot of variation in the formats you get back. A better way that we've kind of achieved the aims is to get data from more centralized sources that might have been gathered by DFT through its bus open data service, and go to those operators and say, hi, we think you operate these routes with these lengths. Can you have a look through our spreadsheet and confirm, is that right? And that's worked very well with operators saying that, yeah, that is right. Or, oh, actually, you've got a few duplicated routes registered more than once, but if you sort it out, that'll be right. Yeah, otherwise, it's quite a struggle to go to numerous organizations and get something back in a kind of consistent format. I think another thing that's been a bit of a struggle has been kind of setting headline targets in BSIPs, when actually those targets are linked to facilities and measures that still aren't funded, and to a network that's changing by the day. So sort of trying to set that kind of thing in stone is quite challenging. So I think a lesson is that, you know, you might not 100% meet what DFT envisaged, because things don't always pan out the way people expect. We're seeing the same kind of thoughts about data in the bus network review guidance that's going on at the moment. I think we're also seeing that EP boards are perhaps not quite as powerful as some had envisaged. I think a model that a lot of them seem to have gone down is that the EP board makes a decision, or at least makes a recommendation, but ultimately that it's the LTA that kind of ratifies that and makes the final decision, and that is holding the money. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. I think now we're also seeing that very good ambition in Bus Back Better meeting with the kind of reality of an industry that's recovering from COVID, I think because of Omicron, perhaps recovering a bit more slowly than some might have wished. Some funding's been diverted into that. I totally understand the reasoning as well as to DFT, rather than spreading the money thinly across all LTAs, such that each of them probably struggle to make a difference, to sort of select a minority, give the money to a minority where they can make a difference with the amount of money they've got. So there is kind of now two kinds of LTAs, those with the funding, those without. The challenge is, it's the work's continuing still with, very tight timescales. There's the shortage of experienced staff I mentioned, the kind of data issues, and LTAs are kind of grappling with promoting improvements while dealing at the same time with, the risks of some networks contracting, and ensuring that their schemes can be delivered to, quite tight timescales, and which is, a challenge for LTAs that might not have a lot of shovel-ready projects. And thankfully, we are working with some LTAs that do have a few projects in the bank. If you go on to the next slide for George.
Thank you, Dominic. I thought I'd try to put together a few things which I interpret as being the major DFT priorities. If I happen to have got any of these wrong, I'm sure colleagues from the DFT on this call will correct me. But the first one, obviously, is bus priority measures, which they consider to be extremely important. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that they consider these to have significant benefits and operating cost savings. The operating cost savings, I suspect, are going to be quite challenging. I think there are three phases for bus priority measures like bus lanes. The first is reliability, and I think that's what most operators hope to gain. The second is, can you actually, as a result of them, make journeys faster, which is quite challenging, but possible. But the really challenging one is, can you make sufficient difference that in actual fact you can save buses and reduce running costs? And that's, I think, going to be the real challenge outside the major metropolitan areas. Advice is that only to introduce them where bus services are frequent, there's notable congestion, and of course space for them. And the need to provide evidence is important in an EP, together with making quite sure that it has the full cooperation of the bus companies. Fares are the next one, and probably these are even more difficult to achieve than bus priority measures in terms of getting operators to agree to simplify and reduce fares. It is possible to do this, and I think it's something which needs to attract non-users, because in the recovery from COVID, obviously trying to get levels back up to pre-COVID is going to be extremely difficult and require different type of marketing approaches and attracting people who may not have used bus services previously. The schemes are also expected to taper down. So if we're looking at part funding, multi-operator acceptance, or we're looking at youth travel schemes, that's the type of thing, but it's envisaged that these will reduce in terms of the subsidy required as increased usage makes up for any loss of revenue. Increased service frequencies is certainly mentioned, rather of a difficult one when we're all in the process of looking at our network review and trying to see how we can deal with reduced demand, etc. But there may well be opportunities there. And I think this needs to be looked at in terms of the network review, because whereas it's difficult to sustain routes where demand simply doesn't justify the frequency are currently operated, the resources can be reused where we identify new locations or new opportunities. A point worth making is that funding shouldn't be for supporting existing service levels. If you're going to use funding, it's got to be for new or expanded routes. Next slide, please. Publicity and concessionary fares. This is quite an interesting one because a little bit downplayed, but I think it's very important, and I think DFT would agree with this. Single source of information. I happened to be perusing my recent copy of Buses magazine the other day, and there was an interesting article by Julian Peddle where he wanted to go to Ludlow in Shropshire for a brief break, I think. It took him a few minutes to find out how to get there by train, and then something like 2 hours perusing the internet trying to find out bus service information. It was all truncated, out of date, hundreds of different sites. The local authority appeared to have given up providing any information, and I think it's probably the simplest thing that you can do in order to provide instant information on any one given site as to how to get around by bus. DFT wants to promote concessionary travel, which is an interesting one. Concessionary travel seems to have lagged behind COVID recovery in terms of coming back to buses. And another one that I haven't seen before, which is when you're promoting or publicising any improvements you do, funded through BSIP, support from Her Majesty's government needs to be acknowledged in that marketing. For DRT, concessionary passes have to be accepted. It's got to be part of the mainstream network. DFT don't expect BSIP to fund DRTs that replace existing bus services, and any DRT services must have a high integration with the normal bus network, including, if at all possible, through fares. Innovation, I put that up there as a light relief. We all like innovation. Autonomous vehicles are all very exciting. I think probably we are talking about major improvements in the short term and not the more long term, although keeping abreast of events is obviously important. Next slide, please. Just a few factors that I picked up myself for those authorities who are busy trying to complete their EP plans and schemes by the end of this month. Don't forget to include all funding for buses, including all the stuff you normally spend on tendered services, concessionary fares, etc., even Section 106 agreements. List existing measures to promote bus usage. That's quite an important one in my view. It demonstrates whether the authority is well on the way to promoting bus usage or is just starting. Include all improvements, whatever the funding source, even if it's not from the public sector. Tie in fare improvements with parking policies. That's a really challenging one. I suspect almost impossible for two-tier authorities where parking is generally under the control of the boroughs and districts, whose main concern, in my experience, has been revenue relating to parking and making sure that parking pays for itself as far as possible. But if it can be done, very important. Okay, it's great to have bus lanes and other priorities, but how are you going to enforce them? Can they be enforced properly? And another important one is, what are the obligations on bus operators? We tend to concentrate a bit on what local transport authorities plan to do, but bus operators are expected to provide their share as well, whether it be through multi-operator ticketing, taking on the comprehensive publicity role, which could be done either by them or the authority, the network branding, driver training, all sorts of things that I've put there, which really bus operators need to sign up to, at least some of them, if not all of them. Good consultation is also important, making sure you cover a broad spectrum of people when consulting on improvements or changes, or indeed bus priority schemes, and not just to a narrow focus of people. And finally, do remember to specify in an EP what services are exempted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Thank you, Dominic. And then on to Frank, please.
Yes. Right, if I could have the next slide, I'll tell you what I'm going to cover in this, and I'm going to do this quite briskly. Three themes that I'm going to cover: our engagement with enhanced partnerships, what was our starting point in that, and what observations can we make that are going to be useful for you going forward. My thoughts on where local transport is going wrong, It's a personal view because I live in a quite rural village. And then 3 key takeaways from the first phase of partnership development. And so if we look at the next slide, here's a whiz through of our engagement with the processes that you've been going through if you're an LTA or even if you're an operator. The work for us is, I say it is a natural progression from what were known as statutory quality partnerships. And there were quite a few of these across the country. But the thing about these that I think we need to keep in mind, because the legislation is very much designed around statutory quality partnerships, and I'm thinking about the scheme documents, obviously, they were very much thought of as corridor specific or targeting interventions in particular areas. So you might have a particular road like the A601, I think that's right, in Manchester, where there's a statutory quality partnership planned. You could look at Birmingham, which had big problems of congestion in the city centre, and where some sort of process of engaging with operators to make sure buses were using bus stops within the city centre efficiently, that led to a statutory quality partnership. And so these were very much focused on dealing with problems. We're now into, of course, something that is actually trying to deal much more holistically with bus services in the area of the LTA. Every LTA was required to get involved in this if they weren't involved in franchising. And it's quite interesting, the comments that WSP made about how it brought in a lot of requirements for resources. And that's certainly something we've seen in terms of working with people that maybe haven't had that familiarity before with bus services, the regulatory requirements, and the practical issues around operating bus services. But from our point of view, we didn't do anything other than prepare until October 2021. And we were preparing because we did expect that some authorities would approach us, some operators might want advice. The first inquiry from a potential client came in late October 2021, and it was about timescale. And there's no surprise in that, because by then the BSIPs were being signed off and people were beginning to realize, gosh, we have to have so much done by March of next year. And so we spent a lot of time with several authorities working through timescale, and it was going to be incredibly challenging. Things changed on, I think, January the 11th, when the department relaxed that timetable requirement. But by then, a lot of good work had been done. And sometimes it is good to have to work to a challenging timetable. We also found that in-house legal teams were struggling to understand what they would be advising upon. And that's why we were approached in several cases. And we've worked collaboratively where where the in-house lawyers have been interested in this, with them, helping them come up to speed with the requirements going forward, because these are schemes where local authorities will not want to have to rely on external lawyers for everything going forward. And then, if we move on, we found ourselves soon advising 4 authorities on process and the details of documents being generated. I've already said the timescale was extremely tight. We mobilised an advisory team of commercial lawyers and competition specialists. In time, we think that there'll be needs for real estate lawyers because there'll be highways related work to be undertaken. But then the key thing for us was receiving documentation from the client in terms of where they had taken it to, because in all cases, these authorities had already started to develop their documentation. And in some cases, we found the documentation just a little bit problematic. And on the next slide, we'll see what I mean by that. Sometimes we found that the plan and scheme documents were actually merged into a single document. Now, there was an explanation for this, because at that stage, there wasn't too much in terms of detailed guidance available. But what there was one authority, Hertfordshire, that had been a trailblazer in wanting to work effectively with its bus operators, and they had created an early example of an enhanced partnership. But they had done that on a basis of having a single document that contained the plan and the scheme. Now, it's important to note that the guidance that DFT makes clear that these are 2 separate documents. And that's an important thing, because going forward, a number of these enhanced partnerships will lend themselves, and it comes back to where I started with statutory quality partnerships and talking about interventions. Some of these schemes will lend themselves to having further scheme documents that are for specific areas. So it could be a specific corridor. And you want to, in that case, if you're the LTA, you want to engage with the operators who are involved in that particular area. And it means that you've got much more flexibility in taking that particular intervention forward, because you're working with that group of interested operators and not treating it as something that everybody has to get involved in. So I'm expecting to see a single enhanced partnership plan, but I'm expecting also to see a number of scheme documents over time, because no one single scheme document is likely to be the absolute right way of dealing with everything that happens going forward. The early precedents were being followed in the area of partnership governance as well. And it's quite interesting that WSP's experience has been the same as ours. And you might think we've rehearsed this, but I can assure you we haven't. But certainly we discovered there was confusion over the role of a partnership board. And the way I put it is it's got to be seen more as a project board with a project, albeit a long-term one, and with a series of sub-projects under it, if you like, that is very much involved in getting the best of both parties out of. But at the same time, the LTA remains the key decision maker, because it's the funding party, as has been said earlier. There could be issues with existing arrangements that the authority has. You know, if the partnership board want to do something in the area of bus shelters, for example, it's got to fit in with the contracts that are in place with, for example, JC Deco, who might be managing bus shelters for a particular area, and you can't do anything until that contract comes to an end or is varied. So there's all sorts of issues that really mean that the LTA really has to have the final say in the partnership decision making. But that's not to say that that partnership board can be a very agile organisation. You're working very collaboratively. We also saw on every project we've been in, every partnership we've worked on, we've had transport consultants alongside us. And that's been very important to the process because of areas such as engagement with operators. Now, I can say, even although we've had 4 authorities, I haven't had a single meeting with an operator in any of these cases, because the engagement has been with the local authority and with the consultants. But we come back to that question of resources, and what I've heard is that in 1 or 2 cases, the consultants have actually been pushed out to have the meetings with the operators without the local authority being there present in the meeting. And I'm not sure that gives the right kind of message to the operators at a time when you're trying to build up that partnership working. If we then move on, experience went through to the making of the schemes. A lot of authorities have already made the scheme, and it involved in some cases potential for the operator objection process to be triggered. That was a particularly tricky issue, given that certainly in the early days we were working to that March 31st deadline. Across all our schemes, only 1 actually went into the second objection period. And in actual fact, it's debatable whether they needed to, because what the legislation says is you only have to go into a second operator objection period if you make a change to the scheme as a result following the public consultation, which represents a modification to the scheme. So I've maybe not explained that terribly coherently, but obviously you have a process in which operators are consulted in the development of the scheme. They have the planning scheme, they have the right to object. And if so many objections arise, then the authority's got to do some more thinking around the detail of what they're planning. It then goes to public consultation. And if you then change any detail in the plan or the scheme that constitutes a modification, you have to go back to the operators, basically saying, is this okay? And there's another objection period. For the clients we worked with, an added element that we added was a compliance checklist document. There's actually an astonishing number of compliance requirements as you progress through the development of the planning scheme. And we thought it necessary to have this because there is always the risk of judicial review in the background if you plan to do something controversial. And of course, clients also receive formal legal opinions covering compliance with competition law. Now then, the next thing, here's some personal comments very briefly, and this is just one example that I want to talk about. If we can move to the next slide. So I'm a village dweller. I used to live in Harrogate. I live in the north, lived in Harrogate. I had the brilliant 36 service provided by Transdev. Sorry to raise a shout out for them and not other operators at this point, but it was a fantastic service. Some people I worked with couldn't understand why a partner in a law practice was travelling by bus to work out here. It's different in London, I appreciate, but there's an impression of bus services that no one in my position would use a service. This was actually a very good service, and it represents a good example of innovation. But I'm now living in a village and things don't seem quite as they were when I lived in Harrogate. If we look at the next slide, something that I found quite disappointing, and this is just illustrative of something that's happening across the country. I would ask you the question, if you came to this bus stop and it was raining, would you stay at the bus stop? Because you're effectively being told, take your chance, there might be a bus or there might not be. And let me tell you why I came across that there. Last weekend, there was an air show at Teesside Airport, which is an operating passenger airport. It's strange to have a air show at the same time. You've got the Red Arrows and flights going out to Ibiza or places like that. There was a problem with the traffic going to the event. I had to abandon my car at Friends and walk 1.5 miles to the airport. That's fine. It was a nice day as far as I was concerned. It was a good bit of exercise. But lots of other people had massive problems with that event, and some didn't actually make it to the event. There is a rail halt at the airport, right at the airport. Trains were not stopping at that. Trains were not stopping at that halt, even on a special basis for that particular event. So the chance to go by train wasn't there. There are venues within Darlington, such as the arena, only 2 or 3 miles away from the airport, where you could have had park and ride. There was no park and ride service provided. And it just shows that a lot more effort needs to go in, I think, to giving people the opportunity to use public transport. And I think some of the problems might still have happened. A bit of it was to do with traffic management, but certainly the opportunities are there if we can have a more integrated system. And it kind of makes the case for franchising if the local authority can have more control over decision making. So that I'm leaving as a thought. If we then go on, the key takeaways I want to give you at this point are, you're making the most of the partnership. Partnerships create opportunities. It's the 2 + 2 = 5 formula, but it requires a collaborative working environment. Your joint authority working needs to be encouraged. You're commuting into cities such as Leeds. York is another example in Reading, where you might be passing through separate partnership areas. That doesn't really make sense if you think about it. I think something to come back to something said earlier, there's now going to be unitary county council authorities. And so that issue about district councils, this is maybe good news in that you'll have a single authority coordinating car parking and bus travel. And I'm looking forward to that because I can see some real potential coming out of that. And then my second takeaway, LTAs need to investigate and be positive about innovation. Your investment in technology, this is where I'm going to run into problems in terms of what was said by WSP, because I think the bus priority measures aren't necessarily the #1 priority. I think the #1 priority is good quality information, even if it is about problems. Let's help get people onto the bus in the first place. If there are problems, if we're informing them about the problem, then that is a good thing. And maybe that's the #1 priority. And I think DFT need to be encouraged to press on with proposals for a local transport centre of excellence. It was within the Bus Back Better paper, and we need to have somewhere that is at the heart of innovation, that is spreading out the message about innovation. And then finally, the process of funding investment, I don't think is fit for purpose. The concept of bidding for funding is too uncertain when we're thinking about projects that require planning. And I've given examples there of precedents, which are the Building Schools for the Future programme and NHS Lift. And those of us that advised on programmes like that, the authorities came into the programme in an orderly manner. They could prepare in advance. And there was a central procurement support that was making sure consistently across all the programs, good quality advice has been given and that there wasn't a reinvention of the wheel. The way the economy is just now, it's too much to expect that to happen. But certainly, I do question the way that we provide funding. And I think that's the story from my point of view.
Sorry, I realised I was on mute. Thank you, Frank. If I can ask Craig to take over, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. My presentation is a brief summary of our bus service improvement plan. So yeah, just next slide, please. Our BSIP was developed in close collaboration with the bus operators, neighbouring local authorities, but also it reflected the needs and desires of over 2,000 survey participants, which also included over 50 businesses and other stakeholders. Next, please. We are basically developed an early mission in terms of what we were looking to do with our BSIP, ensure that East Sussex residents and visitors enjoy the highest possible quality bus services that are frequent with a comprehensive choice. This is obviously, hopefully will reduce congestion and make a positive contribution to better air quality and decarbonisation. Next, please. The key aims of our bus service improvement plan are enhance the bus network itself, first and foremost. Significant improvements in bus provision, frequency improvements to the evening services and the weekend services. And in terms of our BSIP, there is a significant amount of detail in terms of what we propose in terms of our overall ambition, and that is over, I think, about 15 pages of A3 in terms of our BSIP submission. Second to that would be kind of bus priority for us. Bus priority schemes designed to obviously enhance reliability, as George said earlier, first and foremost, better punctuality, but also to reduce journey times as well, make them more attractive to customers, but also have some potential savings, operator savings as well. Next slide, please. Kind of third on our list was the fares and ticketing element. That was kind of made up of in two parts: reduced fares for young people up to the age of 30, reduced fares for all, looking at a targeted fare reduction across the whole of East Sussex, particularly for those in the rural areas which at the moment don't have very good fare offerings. But we also, as well as those two particular schemes, are looking to simplify fares and ticketing in general wherever possible. Additional to that is our improvements to the rural services. We are looking for a step change in terms of what we're looking to do in East Sussex, because there are a large part of East Sussex that has no access to shared transport or bus services. So one of the key schemes within our proposals within our BSIP is the demand responsive transport, digital demand responsive transport, and that is again well detailed within our BSIP. And again, obviously, then bus service for all that relates to the needs and desires of the residents and visitors to East Sussex. Next, please. So what we've actually been, our indicative allocation from the DFT is just over 41 million, close to 41 and a half. That's 22.3 capital, 19.1 revenue. That equates to about 80% of our capital ask and 35% of our revenue ask. That's a 3-year allocation. We're already partway through year 1, and the likelihood is that we'll be over halfway through year 1 before we get our confirmed allocation and the money in the bank. And yes, so we are kind of working at speed to refine our proposals to meet within that allocation and get the biggest kind of bang for your buck and the best value for money in terms of what we're proposing to do. So we are working at speed with a number of consultants on refining those and preparing our scheme documentation for the end of June submission required by the DFT. That's kind of very brief whistle-stop tour of our BSIP. I'm sure a few questions may arise later on, so I'll kind of leave it at that for the moment on the BSIP, and then waiting here for some questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Craig. Tom, if you can take the slides down, that's great. Thank you. We'll move on to the Q&A as we've said. There's lots of questions coming through in the Q&A, so just make sure you keep using that forum rather than the chat. The chat is ready for everyone to see, but it seems to be getting lots of questions through, so that's working. I've got a few pre-prepared questions I'm just going to ask of the panel, and then we'll pick up some of the ones that are coming through, including some that have been sent in advance. So thanks for sending those through before the session if you're one of those. So the first question, can we identify any easy wins that don't require significant funding that can be delivered through the partnership, which we can focus on in the short term to help gather some momentum? Perhaps I can come to Craig to comment on that in the first instance.
Simple terms, no. I don't think in the bus industry there are particularly easy wins that are cheap and will deliver a lot of value for money. I think everything takes a little bit of time and effort. One of the schemes that we are particularly excited about within our BSIP along the lines of potentially returning good value for money is bus priority proposals at traffic or signal control junctions. We have identified 33 locations in East Sussex that we are looking to install the necessary hardware and software to introduce bus priority, and that's virtual using our take system and Move at 8 and virtual triggers to increase bus priority at those 33 locations. When I say it's good value for money, it's not that expensive to do. Could potentially a lot of benefits to buses depending on level of priority you provide to them. The kind of crux is being able to deliver that. So you've got to have the kind of political support, the senior office support to take that through, and obviously support from your network team, etc. But yeah, that's probably one of the schemes that would probably return the greatest value for money in terms of our proposals.
And thank you. And George or Dominic, do you want to comment on that?
I'd quite like to comment on things that could be delivered quickly, because I've represented LTAs that have been successful and have been allocated funding. I've also represented one LTA that weren't allocated funding, and I think something I saw as a real difference and why I have certainly got sympathy for LTAs that weren't, is almost that kind of success breeds success. And I really noticed how the successful LTAs that I worked with, they had these shovel-ready schemes ready to be implemented quite quickly if awarded funding. And the LTA I worked with that didn't have a great history of delivering improvements for bus services, they didn't have these shovel-ready schemes, and they perhaps also didn't have officers with massive experience in bus stuff. They had the officers I dealt with were good, but they'd often been drafted in from other areas. So I think it can be quite, success does breed success, and I think it's tricky if you're an LTA that doesn't have these kind of shovel-ready schemes. Difficult to get yourself into that position if you're not in it already.
Thank you, Craig. Sorry, George. Carry on, and then I'll come back to Craig. Sorry.
I just wanted to say, probably one of the quickest ways of improving matters is improved bus publicity and marketing, particularly pursuing the idea of single source information.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. And Craig?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Dominic said. I kind of agree in part, and yes, absolutely, that seems to be quite regularly the case when authorities bid for money. The kind of larger the teams, the more prepared, ready schemes generally leads to kind of more success when you're putting these bids in. From an East Sussex perspective, I can't say we were in that position. I've only been in East Sussex for just over a year, and it took a lot of time and effort to get into a position where we developed a high quality BSIP. We haven't necessarily had shovel-ready schemes as part of that, so it did take a lot of time, work, consultants. George knows very well how taxing it was to get that submitted, the kind of quality that it is. So yeah, partly agree with Dominic, but there is sometimes an opportunity for local authorities that might not have that kind of size of team or shovel-ready schemes, but it does take a lot of effort. But good quality ideas, good people on the ground, supported by, you know, consultants with appropriate knowledge and ability as well. So, yeah.
Point well made, thank you. So moving on to the second question. So some might say that bus franchising is in fact the only way of securing a viable bus network. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about that. Perhaps I can come to Frank first. You're on mute, Frank.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I don't know if everyone's up to date, but there's a continuing judicial review going on with Manchester and its franchising scheme, which is not something for a topic for today. But what is clear from the ambitions of Manchester to move to the franchising model is to take control of the network and to be the determining party. But of course, it depends how much money they have to spend. And Burnham, I think, has surprised people within the industry by already coming out with there will be a £2 flat fare. So everyone will understand what it's going to cost them. He doesn't have the operational costs yet. So I'm not sure how he can commit to a £2 fare at the moment. But certainly franchising will bring the network to a more coherent basis, if you like. Whether it is the right way to go, I've got serious reservations. The public sector has got finite funding to apply, and it would probably be, if we were looking, say the pandemic happened in 5 years' time and Andy Burnham had his way and there was franchised services within Manchester, would he be not going through a network review at the present time? I'm sure he would be. So there will be some difficulties there, undoubtedly. And I think the collaboration that can happen through partnerships, which operators have been so desperate to persuade local authorities that they should. In Manchester, there was a lot of attempts by the operators to persuade the authority not to move to franchising, but it seems that the political mind is more significant than the practical mind within the authority.
You, Frank. Craig, do you have anything on sort of bus franchising and whether that for you would be more viable?
I think partly dependent on the area. In some of the large urban and metropolitan areas where there's a good deal of competition between multiple operators, then, you know, as it was in London before franchising came into place, then the franchising may work better. It's obviously not proven yet. It works in London, but whether it works elsewhere is still to be seen. In areas like East Sussex and down on the southeast, probably less so. There's major competition between the major operators down here in East Sussex. Both run their services rather well, in my opinion. Good offering in terms of service provision and ticketing. If you were to kind of wipe the slate clean and start from scratch, then possibly franchise might be a good approach. And again, in some areas, but maybe not in others. And it depends on the kind of resource within the local authority to be able to deliver that, because that's going to be extremely resource intensive.
Thank you. George, you might be poised to add to that. Is there anything you want to add, or no? Pop your hand up if you do. I'm picking on panelists, but if you've got anything you want to add to any of these questions, just pop your hand up. Otherwise, I'll keep picking on you. So the next question is a specific one around ticketing. And what do we think are the obstacles to sort of multi-operator day and other period tickets being accepted more universally? Already well established in sort of major urban areas, but how can we make sure they're adopted on a kind of a more universal level, and how can any of those obstacles be removed? Perhaps I can come to George or Dominic on that first.
Thanks, Michael. I think it's largely a question you can achieve it at a reasonable value for money. As soon as you have to have a back office to do the of allocation of revenues between operators, it becomes rather difficult to justify, except in urban areas where there's sufficient volume to make it worthwhile. I suspect that's one reason why DFT are working away, trying to provide a facility for all areas to use. So I think that's probably the most difficult thing to do, apart from the usual competitive view between operators when they are in a competitive state.
Thank you. Frank, anything to add to that?
I think I wonder if it's quite interesting, because there was a conference a couple of weeks ago, the sub-regional transport bodies, and they are going to, I think, emerge as quite a significant player in terms of influencing how local transport operates going forward. And I wonder if we do need to move away from the existing model of decision-making being made at a relatively local level, so that there could be, at a higher level across a region, your abilities to set, if you like, the model for making fares to understand, easier to purchase, and with caps on what you're being charged. I think there is a future for this going out of urban areas, but it will require quite a shift, I think, in the way that local transport is governed, if you like.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. And then I guess, Craig, from your perspective, anything to add to sort of ticketing and pricing and things?
Yeah, I think probably just to back up what you said, there's probably more call for integrated ticketing between bus operators in some of the urban areas where there is probably a real need or demand for travel through multi-operator, more than one operator. Again, in our region, there isn't a huge demand for that. We are looking to introduce a multi-operator ticket as part of our ticketing proposals. As Frank said, we're looking at ticket simplification, we're looking at capping all through our back office system, which there is a cost involved to that, but to allow us to do that within our BSIP proposals and over the period of BSIP, that until we get to a centralized back office system, whatever that looks like. And that's something as part of our roadmap that we'll be integrating with that. But yeah, in real terms, in East Sussex, there is unlikely to be a huge demand, but it might work in terms of capping as well. So if we have an East Sussex day fare of, say, £6, and that applies to all operators, then we can cap that out through one of our ticketing apps, smart cards, etc. So it's certainly what the users want. They don't want to be able to have to work out what bus operator to use, who they can't use and who they can't get on for the same price, and what the price is going to be if they maybe use it on a Wednesday and not a Thursday. They just want simplification, that they can jump on any bus in an area and it'll be a reasonably value fare. But also, and operators tell me they don't really need to know what the fare is, but I think people do want to know what the fare is. Good knowledge as to what the fare is going to be prior to using it, so it becomes more attractive to use the bus services. Simple, yes, but uncapped, yes, value for money, but good knowledge of what the fares are going to be.
Absolutely, thank you. The questions could come in is on competition law, so probably pick on you, Frank, but the question is competition law a barrier to ensuring that enhanced partnerships work to their full potential?
I don't think it is. The one thing that happened over quite a number of years now is that the Competition Commission, now the Competition Markets Authority, has been helpful and quite positive in the way that it's handled issues around bus services and in particular fares. We've had a block exemption in place for many, many years now that facilitates information sharing between operators that then leads to these kind of tickets coming into play. And we've also got provisions within the Transport Act for those that want to go and look at Schedule 10, which even allow the local authority to underwrite's maybe not the right word, because they're not really taking a responsibility for this, but they can sign off agreement between operators, which could, for example, be one that involves the timing of buses, where you've got two operators travelling within the same, relatively the same route. Might want to schedule their buses in a coherent way. They have to have a contractual agreement to do that. That can be signed off by the authority. It doesn't have to go to the Competition Markets Authority. And there's many other situations where you could have some agreement involving the operators working together, which would give a local authority sign off. Now, the local authority would clearly want advice, legal advice, on its decision to approve that agreement, but that makes it much simpler than having to go to the Competition Markets Authority every time. Bus stations, access to bus stations, you may not know this, but there's a long-standing order from the Competition Markets Authority which guarantee access to bus stations for other operators that want to start services within a particular area, and the drivers must have access to the facilities and so on. It's quite detailed. It does for charging infrastructure. I think the order is going to have to be changed. We've got to modernise it. But there's a lot of things happened that make it easier, I think, for operators to work together.
Thank you, Frank. Just looking through some of the questions that have come through. There's one that came in advance of today's session, and it's how will bus users and other stakeholders be meaningfully involved in the process? I don't know if I can ask that question to Craig first. What ESASs have done with sort of getting the views of bus users and stakeholders in the process?
In terms of developing our BSIP, we had a survey early on over 4 weeks and 2,500 responses in total in that survey. We undertook a good deal of analysis of the survey to actually dive down into great detail as to determine what the users wanted to see. Since we submitted our BSIP and then later on got indicative allocation, the timescales that had been set out haven't allowed us to go back out and consult and basically have that kind of potential second round of what do you think we should spend our money on. We haven't just had that opportunity. I don't think any local authority is doing that approach. So it was in the first round. We are working very closely with Transport Focus in terms of a representation of passengers. We're looking to set up new passenger groups in East Sussex using Transport Focus assistance to do that, to make sure that their representation is a true reflection of East Sussex passengers. But yeah, that was the key part of that was the survey that we undertook as part of our BSIP development.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time. I'm just going to try and ask one very quick, merge two questions together, which I can perhaps ask Frank just to do a very quick response on if you can. But in terms of the funding and the BSIP allocation, the linked question is, for authorities that haven't received BSIP funding, what should they do next? And the related question is, will the DFT think be making any further BSIP allocations for local authorities? And you're on mute again, sorry.
I'm going to pass that over to WSP straight away.
Thank you, Frank. It's a difficult question because not only have they not received funding from the government, but they're faced with doing the network review without any additional monies available. I think all they can really do is be as constructive as possible in terms of their network review, to make it a genuine exercise in trying to redeploy resources where possible, rather than simply use it as an exercise in reducing a bus service provision. But I think really they also probably ought to try to learn why they weren't successful, and to try to start taking steps so that if there is another opportunity, and I noticed one of the other questions was related to whether we'll ever see the rest of the £3 billion that was originally offered. If there are future opportunities, that they are actually ready and able to have something which is in line with DFT's priorities and aspirations.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'll hold the Q&A there and start wrapping up. But just to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists, obviously, in giving up their time. So Dominic and George from WSP, Frank from Freeths, and Craig from East Sussex County Council. As I said, there's more sessions in the series taking a deeper dive into the issues around enhanced partnerships. So do keep an eye out for those on our website, and we'll keep you up to date there. We'll be circulating the slides from today's session, along with the summary of some of the key themes that have come out of the talks, and also the Q&A. So on behalf of the panel and Freeths, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us, and I look forward to hosting you another session soon. Thank you.